This lesson will be recorded live because I want you guys to really pay attention. It's very important to master how much paint we use and how much water we use. We have to learn how to use this ratio correctly with our gouache. Paint straight out of the tube is usually the most opaque paint you can use. If you don't add any water and just use a slightly damp brush, you can get a very opaque color. This is very thick, and as you can see, it creates texture very easily, so if you want to do the dry brush technique, that's perfect for it. It's also very opaque, and it will show up quite easily on paper. Let me show you a better example of this with a different color. Again, I'm going in with a slightly damp brush, not a dry one because that would make a really dry brush texture, and I'm going to just paint with a lot of paint. As you can see, it's very thick, and again, it's easy to make the dry brush technique. And if I put this on the paper that's black, you can see the color show up really easily. One more thing to keep in mind is the difference between brands. Holbein gouache is less watery than Winsor & Newton gouache. As you can see, it's already very liquidy even though I didn't add any water to it compared to this one. Now if I paint here, it's still very opaque, but it has not as much texture as the other ones. So that's just something to keep in mind with brands. It's not a big deal. It's really not that noticeable. Now, if you gently start adding water to your paint, just a little bit, and then blending it, you're going to get the right consistency for painting with gouache. It's still going to be opaque, but it's going to be much easier to handle, and it won't make the dry brush texture. Even if I try to, I can't really do it because we are using more water. So it's really about getting that right balance. I mean, for me, it's just a tiny couple of drops, and you can always pick up more paint like this and make it a little thicker if you want to, especially if you're layering. It's almost the same, but this time the paint's a little thicker, and this would be perfect for a second or third layer. Now, this is something you just have to practice and try out yourself. But another thing you can do is add even more water for a clear wash. Now, this will show up just fine on white paper. But if I put this on the black paper, you can barely see it. It's more like watercolor because we used a lot of water and little pigment, just like we would use watercolor. So for this technique, you can only use it on white paper, and the white of the page shows through, and that's why you can see it. This is really great to do for the first layer of your painting. Because if there's more paint down, like right here, and I try to paint over it, even with thicker paint, I can easily reactivate the paint below, as you can see here. But if there's less paint, like right here, and I try to paint over it, it's much easier not to reactivate the paint below. So you really have to just learn how to balance how much water and how much paint you're using, and it's just something that takes practice to master. So I encourage you to just take out a color and do exactly what I'm doing and just play around with how much paint is on your brush, how much water is on your brush, and what the color looks like on the page, how opaque it is, and things like that. Just play around with it and see where you can find your happy medium. For me, my happy medium, it's not too liquidy, but it's also not too thick. It's just a little bit liquidy, like this. This is my perfect gouache consistency. But to get here, you have to practice. And maybe you prefer more water or more paint. That's up to you. Just take a few colors and play with them and see what works for you. Once you master the water to paint ratio, painting with gouache should be a breeze. You can always just use less water to make thicker paint or more water to make thinner paint. That's pretty much the gist of it. It's nothing complicated and nothing fancy. And as you can see right here, this is fully dry, and if I layer on top of it, this will be the easiest to not disturb the layers below because we barely use any paint below it. Fully pink. I could even do a large area like this. That's why I always recommend to use a lot of water and little pigment for your first layers, and just to use it on white paper. But if you paint on darker paper, you don't really have a choice. You have to paint thick all the way through, and you can. You just have to be careful. So grab a color or two or three and try this out yourself. See how the paints interact with different consistencies, and get a feel for what looks right and what doesn't. Like I said before, you're going to have your own preferences with this, and you're going to get better with experience, but by just trying this out on a scrap piece of paper, you're going to learn a lot. So I highly recommend you do this too. Okay, let's move on.